the Honorable Vice Chancellor, West Bengal State University, Professor Jayanto Sengupta, Secretary and Curator, Victoria Memorial Hall, distinguished delegates, guests, scholars, and students. It gives me immense pleasure in welcoming you all to the International Seminar on the Garden in 19th Century India, Context, Meanings, and Metaphors. I shall try very briefly to explain the title of the seminar. Well, India had her own traditions of gardens, and the Mughals paralleled the English in their love for gardens. However, the 19th century acquires a special significance as a historical context, marked by the onslaught of British imperialism, which created unique patterns resulting in a hybrid and palimpsestic vision. Historian P.J. Marshall notes a perennial theme running throughout British imperial experience has been the relationship between the ideas about the ordering of society at home and ideas about the ordering of the empire overseas. Gardens are one instance of such ordering. If extensive greenwoods and neat flower beds, banks of shrubbery were the ideal of civilized living at home, they were all the more so abroad, where the danger of losing one's compass was so much greater, and the need to set an example for subject people so very urgent. As we propose to study the gardens in India in the 19th century, in the context of European colonial expansion, they emerge as spaces marked by imperial motives and colonial interfaces. The conceptualization, designing, landscaping, statuary are impregnated with cultural codes that need decoding and interpretations to understand the complex nature of global cultural exchange spearheaded by colonialism. I would now invite Professor Jayanto Sengupta, Honorable Secretary and Curator, Victoria Memorial Hall, and Professor Bashub Chaudhuri, the Honorable Vice Chancellor of West Bengal State University, to take the seats. Dr. Sneha Kochuri of the English Department will present a token of appreciation to both the inaugural speakers from, on behalf of the department. I would now invite Professor Jayanto Sengupta, Curator and Secretary of the Victoria Memorial Hall, to deliver his inaugural address.
Honorable Vice Chancellor of the West Bengal State University, Professor Bashub Chaudhuri, Professor Amita Sinha, keynote speaker at this conference, my fellow organizer of the conference, Dr. Chandrabha Chakraborty, all the distinguished speakers, participants, attendees, and my dear students. It's a privilege for the Victoria Memorial Hall to have the opportunity of co-hosting with the West Bengal State University this seminar on the garden in 19th century India, context, meanings, and metaphors. We look forward to a day and a half of stimulating conversations on the role gardens have played in the colonial history of India, both physically and symbolically. And I will desist from speaking on the academic content of the seminar, since there are so many eminences to speak on that. I would rather speak briefly on the reasons why we decided to collaborate on this seminar. Normally, we don't team up with universities to do this kind of seminars in the season that is well known in the university circuit as the Ides of March. As a former member of the academia, I know of the pressures on all university departments to organize national or international seminars by 31st March of each year. As a former faculty member of Jadavpur University, I myself had been tasked with organizing international seminars by 31st March and allotted the princely sum of 10,000 rupees from the university's unassigned grant for that noble purpose. So I too had approached with trepidation central government institutions for financial and logistical help and had been duly turned away with a gentle rebuke each time. And now, having crossed over to this side, the dark side, it's usually payback time for me. I usually get approached each winter when spring, that is March, is not far behind, by cash-strapped seminar organizers, and I routinely turn them away with a gentle rebuke. Because there is usually nothing in it for us. But we decided to make an exception in this case, and I would like to emphasize the word exception. This is the exception rather than the rule. Since there are so many faculty members from colleges and universities present in this hall, so I would like to use this little speech as a clear disclaimer. We are doing this, we are not going to do this again, so you have been warned. So why are we doing this? We decided to collaborate on this for 3 reasons. First, because we have a garden stretching over 57 acres, which has many things, which has 6 water bodies, 2 jet fountains, several kilometers of paved pathways, hundreds of benches for resting, nearly 3,000 trees, shrubs, and hedges representing approximately 80 species, and a nursery garden for growing saplings for the purpose of fresh planting, and some of the gardens that you can see from this hall. Every care is taken to maintain a hospitable environment that not only nurtures a large number of trees, but a vibrant local biosphere that provides habitat for a large range of birds, including migratory birds in the winter, swans, squirrels, insects like bees, butterflies, and dragonflies, as well as a large range of fish in our multiple water bodies. The environment is taken very seriously in the campus, which is a no plastics zone, and where organic waste, for example, from our fallen leaves, from the fallen leaves of our trees, or the food waste generated in our canteen, it's turned into compost in a composting machine, and then recycled as landfill and manure into the garden. And this constant attention to the ecosystem has earned Victoria Memorial Hall the official recognition as the cleanest monument in India in October 2015, when the award was personally handed over by the Honorable Prime Minister of India. So that's the first reason. Secondly, it was only last November, less than 3 months ago, that we signed a memorandum of understanding with the University of Exeter and the Royal Albert Memorial Museum in Exeter for a collaborative research and exhibition project on the natural history of colonial India, tentatively called the Empire of Nature, or the Gardens of the Empire. The exhibition, which is planned for next year, seeks to combine the zoological drawings of the so-called John Fleming collection. John Fleming was a East India Company engineer who was also tasked with supervising the Botanical Survey of India after William Roxburgh for some time. And we have the zoological paintings of Indian birds and animals collected by him in our collection. So the proposed exhibition seeks to combine that collection with a large collection of botanical drawings once owned by a person named Richard Creswell, which is in the collection of the Royal Albert Memorial Museum in Exeter. So in other words, this proposed exhibition will squarely address the context, meanings, and metaphors relating to the perception of nature and natural objects in 19th century India. And therefore, it was easy for us to segue from that project into this collaborative seminar. But thirdly and finally, our gardens are not only about the birds and the bees, but they are also a metaphor for many other things. They are a metaphor for the safe haven that it offers to the citizens of an otherwise messy and chaotic city, and for the tens of thousands of stories and romantic relationships that blossom here under our trees. And above all, for the open and eclectic nature of the endless conversations that they sustain in an age when these small mercies assume greater import than in regular times. We therefore thought that this seminar would add another important and relevant strand to the myriad conversations that define the Victoria Memorial Hall. So that brings us to this hall today. And that's all I have to say for now. Once again, I thank West Bengal State University, the Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Choudhury, for collaborating with us. And I especially thank our two keynote speakers for this conference, Professor Amita Sinha and Professor Andrew Rudd, who will be here tomorrow morning, for taking this on at a very short notice. So that's all for now. Please enjoy the conversations. Thank you very much.
May I now request Professor Babur Choudhury, the Honorable Vice Chancellor of West Bengal State University, to say a few words and inaugurate the seminar.
Respected Professor Jayanto Sengupta, the Secretary and Curator of the Victoria Memorial, one of the most important landmarks of the city. Respected keynote speakers, one of them is present over here and one of them will come tomorrow morning. Teachers of my university who have been very active and enthusiastic in organizing this seminar. Invitees, senior members of the Department of English, not only of the university but also of other colleges, students, researchers, staff of the Victoria Memorial, staff of the West Bengal State University, if any, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me tell you, I know very little of the subject, so I will not express my ignorance to the greatest possible level. I will try to be quiet. Sometimes ignorance is bliss, and I will try to follow that dictum. For the last 1 year, Professor Chandrabha Chakraborty was coming to me and telling me garden seminar. So I was thinking, what is this garden seminar? Every time she was telling me, we are doing a garden seminar, I was not understanding. What is this? What is so great about this garden seminar? I was not understanding. So the other day, out of my ignorance, I asked Professor Chakraborty, so kindly tell me what this garden seminar means, because I really do not understand, and she started telling me that, this imperialism and garden, how it has made inroads into our system, how garden has been influencing our civilization and this and that. Influencing in a positive way or negative way, I do not know, because the civilization that we had, in fact we had our civilization within the garden, and that was a natural garden and not man-made garden. Because the Shobhota that is basically Topomon based, that was basically a civilization that was within the garden. And in that particular garden we had nothing to do, because the civilization grew from there. There were very few people, most of it was garden. Now when people started increasing the number between 1800 and 1920, 1 billion people was added to the planet. And in the last 12 years, another 1 billion has been added to the planet. So the way the number of people are increasing, now in this situation you have to create garden. Earlier in the garden we were being created. Now in a different sense, within the people you are creating garden. So that is basically the role reversal that we are seeing, and Victoria Memorial has given us an opportunity to really reflect upon all those ideas, right? And I think within this seminar, a large number of subjects will be dealt with, not only of the imperialism and how garden has shaped up our civilization and this and that, but also the different aspects, because garden is important not only from the point of view of aesthetic but also from the point of view of environmental protection. Because now people are really talking about climate change, people are talking about carbon dioxide concentration going to 480, 490 ppm from the 390, 400 ppm from a value of 280 ppm before the just before the pre-industrial era. So because of that, the concentration of carbon dioxide in air is going up. You see the changes in climate, and in the Paris Agreement very recently done, there has been a capping of 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade rise in temperature. People are really hoping that 1.5 degree centigrade temperature rise will be maintained by the civilizations. In these situations, the importance of the trees, the importance of the forest cover is becoming more and more necessary, and people are talking about all this. People are trying to create all these things. On top of that, when the garden is being created, the garden is being created and also at the same time being destroyed. I am talking garden in a larger perspective, because forest cover is getting destroyed. One needs to understand in a very holistic manner the whole thing. So from scientist point of view, people will talk about the climate change issues. From social scientist point of view, people will talk about how this civilization has been changed, shaped up, influenced positively, negatively because of this garden. And our teachers have taken up a role with the help of the Victoria Memorial. The students of West Bengal State University are getting a chance to come to the city, to see the ambience of the city, to see how the city looks like. Although they are from the city, they may know what a city looks like. But let me tell you, I am coming to this hall for the first time. I have come to that, the painting room over there, as you call it, museum, and seen the paintings. But I have not been to this room. So for all of you here, this is a new experience that you will gather. And that is the purpose so far as the university seminar is concerned. Not for a person like Professor Jayanto Sengupta or Professor Shipra Mukherjee or my respected colleague Professor Chandrabha Chakraborty, because they have seen the world outside and they know what it looks like. But the point is, for my students who represent the rural Bengal, North 24 Parganas, where the audience over here will not really believe me that 75% are first generation learners even today. 40 minutes, 45 minutes from the airport, you just go to North 24 Parganas and you will find there are 70% of the first generation learners who are coming to the university. And they do not know about the university setting, they do not know what it means to be in higher education sector. But they are coming, and it is the role, and very important role, being played by my teachers over there, who are trying to make them feel at home, who are trying to make them literate in all possible sense, and who are really rendering great service towards making the students world class, in the sense that they can go stand on their own and can make a name for themselves. So it is a very important seminar for me, and whatever happens to West Bengal State University today, I feel very happy because I have a small role to play over there. Because whatever is happening, it is happening because of the teachers, because I fundamentally believe, it is my fundamental trust in the university system, that it is the teachers who shape the university or the college. Because if you go to the United States, and you ask who is the Vice Chancellor, there no one talks about the Vice Chancellor, people talk about the Nobel laureates. How many are there in the, on the campus, right? So we want to create that situation where the teachers will make permanent mark on the university, on the colleges, and we are really gifted, we are really happy that we have some very good teachers, particularly the Department of English is one of the best departments in the university, who are trying their best to bring the students up to the level where they can compete with the best in the world. So that is the purpose of the university, and of course I am happy because whatever happens to West Bengal State University, I have a right to be happy. So I am happy. I am indeed pleased and grateful to Professor Jayanto Sengupta for allowing us and for giving us the liberty to intrude into his time and space. That is important. We have intruded into the time and space of Victoria Memorial, and he has reminded that we are one of the very few with whom he has allowed this kind of thing to happen. So we are indeed privileged. So we have intruded. Because of that, we are a little bit sorry, but we are also privileged. So we are indeed happy. And this afternoon, it is a great feeling over here that West Bengal State University, even 3-4 years ago, for all wrong reasons, the university used to come to the newspaper. Today, in the last 3-4 years, you do not hear any bad thing about the university. So it is not because of the administration, it is because of the teachers of the university that you see the improvement gradually towards excellence in higher education. It is not easy to get excellence, to achieve excellence, only because when you talk about universities, you talk about, years of culture, a lot of culture, 100 years, 200 years, 500 years of culture. So university is basically, all culture pots where cultures gradually being deposited, gradually being stored, gradually being cultivated by the teachers. So we are on course, and I feel that if we continue in this manner, in the next 10 years, we will be at a position where West Bengal State University will be one of the universities in the state of West Bengal and in the country which will really be talked about. And the way it is happening, I have every hope in this particular university. We have not achieved, we are on the path of achievement, we have started our journey, and I think we are on right course. If we continue in this manner, it is possible to really explore and to do good things. So I am very pleased, and perhaps I spoke a lot more than what I wanted to, because the more I speak, perhaps the more ignorance I will be able to expose. So I don't want to do that. Thank you very much for coming. Please enjoy. And Professor Jayanta Sengupta is one of the very famous historians and curators in the country who will be able to contribute to a great deal in this particular seminar. All the other teachers, I see Professor Jayati Gupta, a very respected person, Professor Shipra Mukherjee, and all those of my teachers, Somak Mondal. If I do not name Somak Mondal, Somak will be very angry tomorrow with me. Sneha Kaur Chaudhuri, Sravasti Chattopadhyay, they are there, and so they will contribute to this seminar. And the students, please ask questions during the seminar. Please, engage yourself in deliberations. The other day, I'll just end with this. The other day, I went to a seminar in Rahoda Ramakrishna Mission, and in Rahoda Ramakrishna Mission, I met a person called Shomoresh Parida. He is a very bright man. He has worked with Indira Nui of the PepsiCo, the person who is now being talked about for the World Bank chairmanship and all those. She is a very great lady, a very great worker, and he was telling me how she works, and she only took this gentleman from Bombay to New York and all those. So one advice he gave to the audience during his lecture. That lecture was that, whenever you get time, be with smarter people. So you are getting a chance to be with smarter people here. This is a lifetime chance. You can build upon that. So you are with smarter people. I hope it will be a good time for all of you, and you can really cherish the moment you are spending over here. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jayanta Sengupta. Thank you, Professor Bashop Chaudhuri, for inaugurating the seminar. We will now move on to our first academic session. It is my privilege now to invite Professor Jayati Gupta, my erstwhile colleague, former professor of English at West Bengal State University, to come and chair the next session. Professor Jayati Gupta spent a large part of her teaching career at Presidency College, which has later become Presidency University, Kolkata. She specializes in 18th century literature, finds passionate scholarly interest in varied forms of travel writing. Her tenure in 2015 to 2017 at the National Library, Kolkata, as Tagore National Fellow for Cultural Research from the Ministry of Culture, Government of India, enabled her to work on a project entitled The Cultures of Travel in Bengal. She publishes regularly in national and international journals, books, and is currently working on 2 books emerging from her research, one on travel and the other on indigo. Professor Jayati Gupta.
Thank you very much, Shipra, for that introduction, and thank you very much to the Department of English, West Bengal State University, Chandrabha Chakraborty, Professor Chandrabha Chakraborty, for inviting me to this very special occasion. Very, very exciting to be in Victoria Memorial, and the ideal location, I think, for a seminar like this. I would like to call upon Professor Amita Sinha to be here. It's her keynote that we are going to look at. Professor Amita Sinha is a recipient of the Fulbright Nehru Professional Excellence Award 2018 and 19, and is currently a visiting professor in the Department of Architecture and Regional Planning in IIT Kharagpur. She's a former professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, USA. She's the author of Landscapes in India, Forms and Meanings, University Press of Colorado, 2006, reprinted by Asia Educational Services, 2011. Editor of Landscape Perception, Academic Press, 1995, and co-editor of Cultural Landscapes of South Asia, Studies in Heritage Conservation and Management, Routledge, 2017. She was a senior Fulbright researcher at the Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage, INTAC, in New Delhi in 2009, and received the National Merit Award. American Society of Landscape Architects for Cultural Heritage project on Taj Mahal, India in 2001. So we are going to listen to a very, very eminent person who has worked in this area of landscaping and gardening.
Thank you for such a generous introduction, and it's indeed a pleasure to be here in Victoria Memorial and surrounded by gardens. And this feels to me to be like a garden house, with views to the beautiful outdoors. No, if I can have these lights off so that we can see the slides better. So I'm going to begin by asking, what is a garden? And of course, the garden is a trope in the language of landscape, in celebrating nature's beauties and human control over its vagaries. We know it's a form of art making in which nature is shaped in the image of an aesthetic ideal. So I'm going to talk about the 3 garden traditions of India, but let me first start with talking about the garden, where nature is shaped in the image of an aesthetic ideal. So we know that the Garden of Eden archetype is symbolic of mankind's return to origins in a pre-lapsarian state where nature is bountiful and no toil is needed for a blissful existence. Arcadia is imagined by the Roman poet Virgil as an idyllic pastoral landscape where one could live in simplicity and in harmony with nature. The garden archetype is an image of eternal life in paradise. The enclosed garden is equated in Hebrew Song of Songs with a woman, and its derivative, the medieval hortus conclusus, is identified with Virgin Mary in Christianity. The bounded garden, where nature is perfected for sensual delight and pleasure, is defined always in opposition to wilderness in many cultures. The Islamic walled garden in the Indian subcontinent is a very well-known example. Other distinct garden traditions in ancient and medieval Hindu and colonial periods are also based upon the same archetype. expressed differently in different cultural contexts. They hold clues to changing cultural practices and evolving aesthetic tastes, and though disparate in their forms and meanings, have influenced each other in producing hybrid visions. The garden groves visualized in medieval paintings, illustrating the great Hindu epic Ramayana, the medieval Indo-Islamic historic garden districts on riverfronts, and the contemporary municipal park derived from the Colonial Garden are examples of the garden traditions of the Indian subcontinent. The Tapovan, the forest of penance of ancient India, was a garden grove, wrested out of wilderness by the penance of sages, where nature is benign and beasts live in harmony. The Indo-Islamic walled garden represents the great Islamic tradition of garden as an image of paradise, and it was also a landscape of conquest. The post-colonial municipal park is a theme park and is an ideological statement with its root in the English landscape garden, a product of the romantic view of nature. So, although no gardens of ancient India survive or have been unearthed in archaeological excavations, literature and paintings hold a clue to the view of nature as sacred and sentient, and a source of aesthetic experience. Ancient Sanskrit epics and dramas and Buddhist and Jain canon are valuable sources of garden representations in text and word images. We know that gardening was one of the 64 kalas or arts of ancient India, and Upvan, Arama, Udyan, and Vatika were some of the terms used for garden groves. In fact, Vatsyayan, in his classic work, Kama Sutra, written around the 6th century BCE, describes pushpavatikas, flower gardens in dwellings with fragrant flowers, fruit trees, and vegetables planted around a well or a water tank. Pleasure gardens were part of private royal palace complexes, and they were public parks as well. Gardens were not just, for the elite. In fact, the Buddha stayed during the monsoon season in aramas on the outskirts of the cities he visited: Rajgraha, Shravasti, Saket, Vaishali, Kaushambi, and Kapilvastu after his enlightenment. So in Sanskrit literature, personified nature plays a major role in the narrative, and it invokes rasa, which is emotion in its essential aspect in human beings. And this aesthetic experience is shared in the gut, in the body. It's not just a cerebral experience. And it's sensual as well as cerebral. It's somatic and intellectual. The plot usually unfolds in gardens or natural archetype or landscapes where nature shares the emotional states of major protagonists. And Shringar and Viraha are examples of rasas infusing those who are in love or suffering from pangs of sorrow caused by separation from the beloved. And nature is interwoven in the narrative, carrying the plot forward and at times becoming a protagonist in subplots. And as such, it performs a very crucial role in the story, ensuring its representation in all art forms. Bird imagery of garden landscapes and their visual images in paintings convey rasa shared by humans and nature. The garden images in Indian art are based upon oral and textual narrative traditions, and they're very strongly influenced by the demands of storytelling. And as a form of narrative art, these medieval court paintings follow stylistic conventions that depict the unfolding plot and actions, all in syncopatic representations of the passage of time and space. In other words, the painting is not just about a specific view. There are a number of things happening, here. So if you see from the right-hand side, from towards your right-hand side, you see Ram, Sita, and Lakshman approaching. And then you see Sita, preparing the floor in the kuti. There is Ram and Lakshman hunting. And so it's like it's a synoptic representation of the passage of time and space. Sequential episodes are depicted within the picture frame, not necessarily in a linear order. And paintings are like stage sets, except that the performers are virtual and not real. And often one sees the unfolding events in very wide perspective, complete with props that add meaning to the scene. Natural elements are iconic, and their visual representations range from being schematic to being lifelike. So Ramayana paintings on cloth, paper, and walls are both objects of devotion and mnemonic aids in storytelling in miniatures. Scrolls were made by itinerant bards for public recitation of Ramayana, and miniatures were produced through collaboration between the artist and the scribe in the royal court. The visual illustrations present the character and settings in vivid colors and shapes, thus anchoring them firmly in individual and collective memories. Landscapes are almost never the sole object of the Ramayana artist, although Mogul paintings and paintings produced in the courts of Chamba and Gular Kangra show fairly well-developed composition of hills, streams, and foliage. Landscape is a setting for human and divine actions, but rarely a framed view, and a source of aesthetic appreciation in and of itself. So these miniatures flesh out the contrast between wilderness and gardens. They portray vivid personifications of nature, and they evoke feelings inspired by rasa. The miniatures celebrate a way of seeing, a mode of perception unique to the cultural ethos. Nature is always present in the picture frame, even though the paintings are not exclusively about the landscape as they are in the Western genre. Vision is not a distant sense encompassing panoramic views of landscape, but it is almost tactile in the perception of immediacy. Landscapes are not framed as distant views, but range from abstracted elements to fully fleshed out decorative details that loom close, pressing in their nearness. Colors are hot, and in their vividness and narration, they render the landscape not as extending out in the distance, but nearby. And this startling immediacy and dynamism, created in large part from the synoptic mode of depiction, creates a very sensual aesthetic and emotional effect, invoking bhavs appropriate to the theme. And the symbolic meanings of landscape representations are best captured in the idea of natural archetypes, which are used in the Platonic sense of ideal form. Well, archetypes are believed to reside deeply in the collective unconsciousness, and they are manifested as images in the physical world. Religious myths and folklore are rich in archetypal imagery in South and Southeast Asia, and Ramayana offers much in this regard. So we have natural elements, the trees, rivers, and mountains, which are archetypal elements whose meanings are derived from the part they play specifically in the story, and they're resonant with widely held meanings within the culture at large. They combine to form Tapovan, an archetypal cultural landscape exemplified in hills overlooking a confluence of rivers and forest clearings, inhabited and imprinted by human actions and invested with symbolic meanings. So the garden grove and the Tapovan are settings of the unfolding narrative, not just as pleasant backdrop, but contributing in an essential way to the meaning of the episode. And this representation is a deliberate gesture intended to evoke an enhanced emotional effect. So literally translated as a forest of austerity, Tapovan is a pastoral landscape of benign and beautiful nature, where sages build their ashram and Ram, Sita, and Lakshman spend their 14 years of exile. And this landscape is an antithesis to wilderness, where demons lurk, imbuing their surroundings with chaos of moral dissolution. So in contrast, the Tapovan is an island of order, and it's an Eden-like sylvan setting that is a natural garden of great beauty where beasts of prey live in amity and hermits meditate, compose philosophical treatises, and perform sacrifices. Here, fears and dangers of wilderness are banished, and nature's spirits are beneficent and kind to humans. Nature appears to turn a benign face and is munificent with rich offerings of fruits and flowers. The pastoral landscape is imbued with the penance of sages who live in forests to be away from distractions of the urban milieu. And their moral force generated by their austerities purifies nature of its dangerous, violent aspects, rendering it kind and harmless. So we see that mountains are a key feature in the Tapovan of Ram, Sita, and Lakshman's exile. They're sites of habitation, offering a refuge from the hostile landscape, as well as an environment rich in bounties of nature. So here in this painting, you see Chitrakoot Mountain, where Ram, Sita, and Lakshman spent many happy years of their long exile. And this overlooks, the hill overlooks the confluence of Mandakini and Paiswani rivers. The riverfront is a place for bathing, listening to learned discourses by sages. And in depictions of Tapovan, animals inhabit the landscape, signifying nature's lushness and variety. As gentle creatures living in harmony with each other, they infuse the landscape with goodness and compassion, with none of the violence and terror of wilderness. So often you see pairs of swans, peacock and deer, symbols of love, which add charm to the landscape and aid in creating a sylvan, idyllic setting. The palace gardens of Ayodhya, Janakpuri, and Lanka are pleasure settings designed for sensual delight and enjoyment, where nature is controlled not through austerities, but by human design. And they're depicted in these paintings with pavilions, water channels, and pools, and filled with aromatic flowering vines wrapped around trees and flowering shrubs. Now, this painting is an 18th century painting, and we see the Islamic influence already in the pathways in the Charbagh. But what's interesting here is that there's a shrine to goddess Parvati. The garden in Janakpuri, where Ram and Sita first meet and fall in love, has a shrine to the goddess Parvati. And in other Vatikas also, small shrines are common. Sita expresses intense virha when she is abducted by Ravan and held captive in the garden grove Ashokvan in Lanka. And the Ashok trees in the grove share her anguish. I believe that the significance of Tapovan transcends those of individual sites. The Ayodhya, Chitrakoot, and Hampi, pilgrim destinations today that draw their sacredness from epic events. The forms and meanings are evidence in the wider cultural landscape of India, where trees are landmarks and resting places, rivers are crossing to the distant lands and other worlds, and mountains are for building shrines. And this archetypal vocabulary is a form of cultural capital that can be drawn upon today in recultivating the idea of sacred landscape and, by extension, all of inhabited land as a garden. This garden metaphor can guide the creation of groves today and water bodies. It can guide the cleaning up of our polluted rivers and the protection of sacred hills. The urban landscape of India began to transform with the Islamic conquests. Domes and minarets of mosques replaced temple shikhars, and palaces and mansions were designed with Islamic-style ornamentation. The regular and symmetrical garden appeared as an extension of Palatine architecture and as an autonomous entity in the larger landscape. The Indo-Islamic Garden, in celebrating the idea of paradise as a garden, was an icon of luxury meant for a tiny number of privileged few. It embodied a view of nature that Islam brought to the subcontinent and reordered the landscape through large-scale engineering works. The most innovative contribution of Islamic culture to the design landscape, of course, was the Mogul Garden, whose mutant form survived until the beginning of the 20th century. Arriving with Babur in 1526, the Mughal garden held sway for more than 3 centuries and outlasted the Mughals themselves in the gardens of Rajput rulers of Western and Central India. The Mughal garden in Rashtrapati Bhavan in New Delhi, designed by Lutyens in early 20th century, was the last tribute to this glorious tradition. As pleasure or tomb garden, the Indo-Islamic garden lined riverbanks, nestled in palace courtyards, and became a resting place on major highways entering the city. It could justifiably be traced to the spatial archetype of the cross within a square and the Quranic image of paradise, flowing water channels, shady groves, and viewing pavilions. Exclusive to royalty and nobility, it was a clear emblem of authority and a theatrical stage setting in the exercise of power. The Char Bagh and its variants expressed an intricate geometric party of raised stone walkways and flowing water channels, celebrated a vision of nature very different from the indigenous view. The Quranic vision of paradise as a garden was translated into earthly gardens that marked territorial conquest of a territory. The tradition of using gardens as an instrument in founding and expanding a settlement extends, of course, back to Babur, the first Mughal emperor who built gardens at his sites of encampment on the banks of the river Yamuna as he pushed into the interior of Hindustan in his foreign military campaign. And these gardens were landscapes of conquest, reflecting the garden traditions of Samarkand and Kabul brought by Babur to the hot and dusty Hindustan. The garden was a pleasure setting in a ruler's lifetime and a backdrop to his magnificent mausoleum erected after his death. Like European gardens of the same period, such as the one at Versailles in France, Mughal gardens lent nature to human will in grandiloquent gestures, creating a sense of supreme order by framing visions in long sweeping vistas. This photograph of Rambagh was taken a while ago. Hopefully by now, this has been restored. I think Idala's garden has been restored recently. And I hope Rambagh is too, because it's really the oldest garden in Agra. Strategically located pavilions and chhatris commanded panoramic views within the garden. It was a continuing reminder of the ruler's dominion beyond his lifetime. Now, in elaborate waterworks, water was drawn from wells dug in the riverbed by teams of oxen working the pulleys, conveyed by aqueducts, and stored in cisterns at ever-increasing heights, building enough pressure for water to erupt in hundreds of fountains in the garden. So when you are at Taj, and next time you're in Taj, if you can just take a small detour and go to the Khane Alam Nursery, which is not very far away, you'll see the entire waterworks still intact. And all they have to do, all that ASI has to do is to do just a little bit of restoration, and this waterworks will be working again, because the Khane Alam Nursery right now is kind of almost like a private space, it's just providing plants to the Taj garden. In the terrace gardens in the plains of northern India or in Kashmir, water cascaded from one level to the next, collected in pools with island platforms, and splashed over chini khanas in Sawan Bhadra pavilions. Many new and exotic varieties of flowering and fruit trees were planted in patterns that echoed the woolen and silk carpets made in the royal karkhanas. The night blooming and fragrant flowering shrubs and vines created aromatic landscapes that came into their own as the evening cooled into the night. The Mughal design aesthetic was tied to a distinctive garden experience in which the cultural modes of etiquette and expressive behavior, solitude and social interaction, leisure and ceremony were guided by the spatial layout and by the architectural elements. The pavilions were more than viewpoints. They were sites of coronation, and they were thus parts of the state apparatus for display and commemoration In fact, the Shalimar Bagh in Delhi, which is kind of neglected now, was the site of Aurangzeb's coronation. The Shalimar Bagh on the banks of River Ravi in Lahore is an example of how the Quranic image of paradise was adapted to serve as a pleasure setting that also displayed the power and authority of the Mughal court. The archetype of the Char Bagh, the four-square garden, reproduced a spatial layout of the Mughal military camp. Its terraces reflected the spatial hierarchy of the Mughal court and were a theatrical backdrop to the exercise of power in court rituals. They controlled the degree of access. The summer house of the emperor was located on the uppermost terrace, towards your left, at the end of the central axis, overlooking the entire garden. And he received petitions in the Diwan-e-Ham, the hall of public audience, in the lowest terrace. The middle terrace had, oops, I don't know if this is working. The middle terrace had pleasure pavilions and the emperor's marble throne in a large water tank and a sunken room with walls of water cascading over the niches. Visual access formed by buildings, water channels, and pathways directed the sight line to the emperor's living quarters and the court. The landscape of power indicated the Mughal emperor's claim to divine kinship as the vice-regent of Allah on earth. I want to shift a bit and move on to Lucknow and talk about the Islamic Garden, the Indo-Islamic Garden there. Also talk about the colonial gardens of Lucknow, and most importantly, the post-colonial park, municipal park, contemporary park in Lucknow today. We have many experts here, including Nita Das, who's written extensively and researched Lucknow. Gomti riverfront in Lucknow in the Nawabi period, which is 1775 to 1856, was an eddied landscape of palace and suburban gardens, country houses, and parkland. And this landscape evolved quickly as each succeeding Nawab sought to make a political statement through grand architectural gestures, both secular and religious. Although opinions about Nawabi architectural style vary, ranging from bastardized to hybrid, architectural historians and critics agree that the jumble of buildings that constituted a palace complex were related to each other through courts and gardens. So here, we see palaces. 3 out of 4 palaces were situated on the Gomti, and one not too far away from the river, indicative of the value placed on what proximity to the river afforded: cooling breezes and expansive views, boat rides for pleasure, a relief from the heat and congestion of the city, and plentiful sources of water to the many gardens within the palace complex. While the high walls of Machi Bhavan were built on a hill, somewhat on a promontory, built in a way to present a fortress-like appearance, the walls of the next palace complex, Chattar Manzil, were built into the river with arched openings that allowed the water to flow into the lower floors. Rooftop terraces and pavilions were an opportunity to linger and enjoy from a very high vantage point the river in all its moods. Now, the romantic view of nature as refuge from the ills of the congested city and a source of moral goodness and spiritual solace was brought by the Europeans to the Indian subcontinent. Invoking mystery and surprise through imitation of nature was an antithesis to the order and symmetry inherent in the Mughal garden. The colonial picturesque was an attempt to mimic the English picturesque park derived from the hills and countryside of Lake District, Wales, and Scotland in the colony. The colonial gardens in their spatial vocabulary, plant materials, location, and associated meanings were a clear departure from garden traditions of the past. Victorian ideas about gardens as collection of flora and fauna, as memorial sites, spaces for solitary contemplation of nature, governed the layout and substance of the colonial garden. It was meant to ameliorate the squalor and crowdedness of the native city, its miasma, and its contaminants. It mimicked nature in serpentine lines and mounded forms and collected flora and fauna that Europeans were discovering in the Indian subcontinent. Nature was a collectible good, based upon its scientific value, in stark contrast to the divine associations in the Hindu worldview and to its purely aesthetic qualities in the Islamic culture. The colonial garden achieved the status of a quasi-public park meant for enjoyment of the resident European community in the Indian city as it grew in the post-mutiny era. It accommodated new kinds of active sports, the tennis, badminton, cricket, polo, hockey, in addition to accommodating the passive recreational pursuits of strolling and promenading, social get-togethers, and solitary contemplation of nature. Momentous changes in the 19th century in political and economic spheres had far-reaching impacts on the cultural landscape of the Indian subcontinent. A new landscape idiom was introduced in the Indian city. Open space was no longer internalized in walled gardens and enclosed courtyards, but it formed the context of the detached building as in the bungalow. The mixed-use pre-industrial urban pattern existed in an uneasy juxtaposition with the colonial city and its separation of residential and commercial. So cantonments for the armed forces and civil lines for European officers in grid iron layout became the new centers of power built at a distance from the overcrowded and unhygienic indigenous settlement. The tree-lined mall made its appearance, as did botanical and zoological gardens, polo parade and racecourse grounds, and memorial gardens, all designed in the picturesque style. New landscape types, such as Soldier's Garden, Archaeological Park, and the hill station were reproduced across the Indian subcontinent. Equestrian activities were the center of recreational life in the colonial culture. The Imperial Horse Show, All India Polo Tournament, racecourse competitions, daily horse riding shaped a landscape of open grounds and tree-lined avenues. The 1 to 5 acre bungalow compound supported outdoor forms of leisurely socializing in garden parties, afternoon teas, and receptions. The urban landscape of cities such as Lucknow began to transform in the mid-19th century. Public parks were built for the expanding European population in the civil lines and the military cantonment in Lucknow as elsewhere in the Indian subcontinent. Many private royal gardens disappeared, and a few, such as Sikandar Bagh and Banarsi Bagh, were transformed into public botanical and zoological gardens. New parks were built in the demolished quarter of the old medieval city and within and around the palace complexes. And they were based on a very different concept of nature, aesthetic order, leisure, and recreation than those held by Nawabi royalty and nobility. So here in this you see a 200-meter swath was cleared around the Nawabi fort of Machi Bhavan, and it became the focal point of 3 500-meter roads. One was named after Victoria Street, built by Robert Napier, a military engineer in charge of rebuilding Lucknow after the mutiny. This urban surgery, in a bid to quell any further uprising through rapid movement of troops, not only opened the walled Nawabi Palace to public gaze, but also cleared land for park building. The colonial era commemorated the imperial regime and its figurehead, Queen Victoria, in numerous parks across the country. In Lucknow, too, a Victoria Park and a Victoria Memorial were built in the historic city. In front of the chalk, the spine of Old Lucknow, a park was built as a memorial to East India Company, and a bronze statue of Queen Victoria was erected there in a jubilee year in 1892. An ornate marble canopy in the Indo-Saracenic style, Victoria Memorial was built in the park north of the partially demolished Kaiser Bagh, the last Nawabi Palace complex. And this park was renamed in 1972 as Begum Hazrat Mahal Park after the wife of Wajid Ali Shah, the last Nawab of Lucknow, who led the mutinous forces in the uprising. With the passage of time and waning of Mughal power and court culture, the Indo-Islamic Garden was rediscovered and modified in the light of European ways of seeing, appreciating, and being in the landscape. The private Mughal gardens, such as Shalimar Bagh in Lahore, began to be used by colonial administrators for public functions. The tomb gardens became comfortable, picturesque settings for colonial residences, schools, churches, and offices. The quintessential memorial park of the colonial era in Lucknow is the Residency Memorial that commemorates a traumatic event in the British history when 6,398 men, women, and children were besieged by Indian insurgents for the 6 months in the uprising of 1857 in the 33 acres of Residency complex. The battle-scarred buildings were preserved amidst rolling green landscape of lawns and shrubs, obelisks and cenotaphs, and a cemetery in verdant surroundings. And the main residency building is preserved as a mutiny museum, complete with a clay modeling of the entire complex, paintings and lithographs of the event, and portraits. This was the history from the British point of view, and it was only in 2004 that the basement was refurbished to show the uprising from the Indian point of view. Now, the perception of nature as therapeutic, with the park as relief from urban congestion, played a role in public hygiene movement in town planning in the 19th century. We know that. But these ideas continued to prevail well into the 20th century in the post-colonial era. Public parks were to remain an effective planning tool in providing an antidote to urban density, in attracting new development, and in preventing encroachment by the landless and homeless. While the colonial park excluded the native Indian, its post-colonial version keeps out the marginalized squatter, the vendor, and the rural migrant. The archaeological parks continue the colonial legacy. The influence of the English landscape park is visible in the manner in which heritage buildings are set in rolling green lawns, such as Lodi Gardens in Delhi. Others appear to serve as no other purpose except to provide a green, neutral foil to monuments that would very likely have been situated in open spaces very different in character from the landscape park. Now, Lucknow has seen a large increase in park buildings since the late 1990s. The proliferation of green spaces in the city has indeed given it a facelift, and it has contributed to its image through cultural identity markers and provided an opportunity for a free play of ideological rhetoric in park iconography. Now, a majority of these parks contain statuary, not surprisingly, memorial plaques, inscriptions, and other historic references. They commemorate political leaders, social reformers, mythic figures such as Gomti, past event in the city's history, nation's struggle for independence, and social reform movements. They reiterate the city's unique cultural identity and its significance as the political capital of the most populous state in the country. The memorial park in the center and periphery of the city include those created by preserving its architectural monuments and picturesque landscapes, and also the newly emerging political ideologies of the post-independent Lucknow. All in their layouts and planting are reminiscent of the colonial park aesthetic, and with the exception of Monument Park, are dependent upon an extensive iconographic program of statuary and plaques for memorialization. They are post-colonial attempts to recover a cultural self from a mythic pre-colonial past and to carve out mostly a party-based political identity in the public realm. The design vocabulary, wide expanses of lawn, winding paths, shrubbery and flower beds, curvilinear water bodies, statuary at focal points is employed with minor variations in the post-colonial park. So Lucknow, as in other Indian cities, continued the imperial tradition of erecting statues in the memorial parks and at city crossroads. Statues of the leaders of freedom movement, some of whom became office bearers of the government of independent India and of Uttar Pradesh, were erected in parks, plazas, and street crossings. And here you see Sarojini Naidu Park, named after the first governor of Uttar Pradesh, Sarojini Naidu, a freedom fighter and Congress party leader. It has her bust on a raised terrace overlooking a large lawn. Scattered references to national and state leaders have evolved into dominance of political and ideological representations in public space. The last decade has seen a new kind of memorial park that commemorates party ideology, its leaders and social reformers who have inspired the party leadership. The scope of memorial making has broadened beyond the state and its representatives to competing party ideologies revolving around those who bring about historic social change and their co-option into current political rhetoric. The small municipal park derived from the Colonial Memorial Park containing a statue or two has become monumentalized, grandiose in its conception, and lavish in its details and execution. So here you see the small folk statue of Ambedkar, now a 15-foot bronze statue in Ambedkar Sthal. The size and number of statues has proliferated, as have canopies, buildings, and gateways in the ever-increasing park area. The large numbers of inscriptions, statuary, murals, and dioramas, together with the contrived design vocabulary, encourage both literal and metaphoric readings of the park. The Memorial Park Plaza thus becomes a didactic statement and a representational tool for the political rhetoric. Ambedkar Sthal and Ram Manohar Lohia Park, adjacent memorial parks in southeastern Lucknow, compete with each other in their size and amenities. They represent rival political parties, Bahujan Samaj Party and Samajwadi Party, and their deliberate exercises in upstaging each other. So here we see Ambedkar Sthal, designed by Mayawati. It's truly, truly grandiose. This is Ram Manohar Lohia Park, designed by the landscape architect Muhammad Shahir. This also spreads over 85 acres. It's walled, with 5 gateways, 6 memorial cylindrical pillars with embedded steel plaques on the leaders of Samajwadi Party line the walkways, and the central feature is the tall statue of the Samajwadi leader, Ram Manohar Lohia, on a pedestal encircled by 4 pylons. While the size and location of many of these memorial parks ensures public visibility and a place in the must-see sites of the city, I say they are not true civic spaces where all are welcome and where political activities are permissible. In addition to being walled and gated and patrolled around the clock by security guards, they are designed, which is expansive green lawn, fountains, expensive building material, is suggestive of elitist attitude towards nature and recreation. There appears to be a mismatch between the ostensibly populist note of the political rhetoric and the elitist style design vocabulary. The dominance of political symbolism represents a lost opportunity for affirming the unique identity of the city as a city of gardens, of Nawabi gardens and park system. The inability of the parks to accommodate anything other than passive recreation and visual contemplation precludes their use as sites of protest, conflict, and dialogue between social groups. As gated enclaves for office workers and middle class and upper middle class residents of Lucknow, memorial parks are ideological statements of faith, occasionally serving the purpose of ritual commemoration, but hardly supportive of new forms of political and social activism. So today, in contemporary landscape design practice, Mughal gardens inspire mostly themed landscapes. The influence of ancient landscapes is largely in symbolic associations of individual natural elements rather than in spatial composition and formal design. The colonial design typology is taken for granted, rarely examined critically, and employed indiscriminately in private gardens and public parks. Its legacy, the legacy of the 19th century colonial garden, has proved to be an enduring one, to the detriment of new experimentation and reinterpretation of the indigenous landscape tradition. In innumerable municipal parks and neighborhood parks built across the country since independence, the lawn trimmed with flower beds remains a key feature. The generic municipal park is based upon the front lawn blown to a large scale, to which are added fountains, playground equipment, other garden paraphernalia. Although the municipal park provides a much needed greenery in dense urban neighborhoods, it's resource intensive in its upkeep and ignores local ecology. It will be instructive to look at other than colonial landscape precedents for contemporary park design. Productive landscapes of mango groves and other fruit orchards bring economic benefits to their owners, requiring fewer resources for their upkeep. The garden hydrology offers useful lessons in aesthetic and utilitarian aspects of water management in ways in which the water is collected and harvested, distributed for irrigation, and creates reflective surfaces. The other local precedent, of course, is the landscape of orchards. Amrakunjo, large shade trees and fruit orchards are adapted to climatic conditions and can be irrigated by using traditional methods of harvesting water, harnessing water and harvesting water. So in Udayan, in the ashram in Shantiniketan, you'll see the small tank inside the garden, and I'm told that it's very much a part of the Bengal countryside. As example of community engagement and sustainable productive land use, the orchard, the Vatika, is a useful model for future park design. The vernacular precedents have proved to be socially and environmentally sustainable in the past, requiring modest investment of resources in their making and very little maintenance. They are suited to the hot, dry climate of northern Indian plains in ways that the colonial lawn is not. Open spaces as sites of active recreation and commerce, working landscapes of orchards and community gardens, the flexibility of Maidan for disparate uses are aspects that could be incorporated in future parks, making them multidimensional, vibrant public spaces. Instead of the gated monumental enclave, a park model could be developed that is more inviting, inclusive of all socioeconomic groups, addresses a gamut of user needs. Indigenous views of nature that do not focus solely on its derivative ornamental element, but engage in productive aspect and draw upon the sacred symbolism of tree as a house of God and water as purifying. Sacred trees and medicinal herbs in Ayurvedic gardens could be included in the planting palette. Spaces could be leased out for community gardening, and if the park is large enough, for flower nurseries and orchards. Finally, I'd like to say that memory work occurs not just through statues and plaques, but through more abstract modes of representation. Public art could free up civic space for a citizen-driven, non-political agenda. Literary and artistic figures of the city can be encouraged to contribute to art installations, and open-air concerts can keep alive the musical heritage in public parks. The transition from a non-iconographic vocabulary for memorial design can only happen if the person-centric political discourse shifts to that of principles and policies on social welfare with a focus on everyday life. And thus the installation could expand beyond the deified individual to collective symbols, creating diverse visual cultures in the public realm. Thank you.
It has mapped the entire trajectory of the change that has happened in the Indian garden. And it's like a cartography of the Indian garden scene, as it were. And I'm sure that for our students, each time you see a garden now, you will like to see how it has been shaped and how it has been structured. And what is most interesting is that not only have we gone through these gardens chronologically, but as a case study, since Lucknow was taken as a case study, we've seen many aspects of this, and there have been many suggestions about how the new garden space, which is being created by by municipal organizations, by cities, and by towns, how that can be a more inclusive kind of a space. So we do have a lot to think about. We do have a lot of deliberations, which we are looking forward to in our next lecture and in the deliberations tomorrow. So thank you very much indeed for this.
Before we end the session, something we should have done earlier, I would request our students, Koena and Orithru, to please give the Utturyo to Professor Amita Sinha and to Professor Jyoti Gupta. We have a short break now of 15 minutes for tea and snacks, after which we reassemble here once again for the second session to be chaired by Professor Gupta. Thank you. To the next session of our seminar today, may I request Professor Jyoti Gupta to chair. 8 hours, whichever is. Okay. I will request our student Ornob to please give the Utturyo to Professor Rothnapuli Chatterjee.
Yeah, may I introduce our speaker, a plenary speaker, Professor Rothnapuli Chatterjee, who is from the Department of Islamic History and Culture, University of Calcutta. She retired in 2006, but has been ever so active even after that. She was also the director of the Women's Studies Research Center, University of Calcutta for several years, and a member of the West Bengal Women's Commission from 1992 to 2001. Her chief fields of research have been the history of medieval Indian art, women's history, health and prostitution, and women artists of the 20th century. She delivered the Shukhalata Rao Memorial Lecture at Jadavpur University in 2010 and the Shudha Boshu Memorial Lecture at the Asiatic Society, Kolkata in 2013. Her books, From the Karkhana to the Studio, Changing Social Roles of the Patron and Artist in Bengal 1990, and Dorbari Shilper Shorup, Mogul Chitrakotha 2001, and the second edition in 2015. So, Professor Rothnapuli Chatterjee.
This big introduction anyway. I'll start straight away by saying that actually, in some ways, I felt before I came to this room that I was a bit of an imposter, because my area of work has always been painting. And I have, lectured and seen the collections in the Victoria Memorial, even worked here as an honorary cataloger for some time. So this is a place which I know very well. But at the same time, you always feel very scared with the change in technology, with the way things have gone. And the number of studies that have been done in architecture particularly garden architecture. I really was quite scared before I came, but I'm very glad that I did, because I learned a lot anyway. So I'm actually going to talk about, the depictions of gardens in painting, as I've seen, and also the change in the language of depiction, too. So this will give us a kind of a historical perspective. Anyway, the paper is called Paradise Lost, Transition from Mughal to Colonial Gardens, because I'm going to begin with a quotation, which most of you probably know. Gar firdos bar rai e zamanast, haminast, o haminast, o haminast. If there is a paradise on earth, it is here, it is here. This is by Amir Khusro. This is inscribed in a black pavilion at Shalimar Bagh in Kashmir, and as you well know, also in the Red Fort at Delhi, in the Diwani Khas, over the corner arches of the northern and southern walls below the cornice. So paradise was associated not only with the garden outside, but also with the dwelling place. And paradise was a place where there was to be no contradiction, where there was no strife, where there was no death. Now, the Mughal gardens were planned on the general models of Islamic gardens, which were indivisibly linked with paradise, which it foreshadowed. The metaphor, if paradise is taken from the Quranic verses, it was perceived as the center of the earth where 4 rivers divided the space in 4 parts, and therefore it was known as the Cheharbagh. Architects interpret this geometrically into a rectangular layout enclosed by walls divided into 4 parts by 2 intersecting canals with a pool of water in the center. Sometimes they were also made into fountains. Most studies of gardens have approached it from the architectural point of view. As you have seen today, it was an excellent talk which gave us a lot of information. Since I'm incapable of doing this, I've taken my cues from art historians who've studied the garden as landscapes, and not just as landscapes, but as how landscapes were depicted. Now, what is a landscape in terms of, if I'm looking at paintings? In simple terms, it is a particular depiction of space expressed through the visual language of its time. The garden in this context is seen as an idyllic place where the spectator finds peace, serenity, sublimation from material care, or a place of pleasure or festivities. Certain elements are constant in this kind, and social events. Certain elements are constant in this garden. It's supposed to have trees, plants, flowers, water. At the same time, we must remember that certain elements are also constant in painting, which is lines, colors, and the use of space. Sometimes these, in terms of the garden, sometimes these appear as geometric structures, that is, as a part of the architectural pattern. At others, they provide a backdrop to the narratives, sacred and secular, in which they merge into the surrounding landscape. Gardens are depicted in painting generally reflect the changes in the aesthetic perceptions of the patrons and the audience. One of the points that we need to remember here is the complex nature of Islamic art and architecture. It developed by incorporating the pre-Islamic art practices from those countries which they inhabited. This included India. While Babur was the first Mughal to have laid out gardens, he was followed by Humayun, who, though living for a short time as a ruler, also dreamt of his city as a huge garden city, Dinpana. Akbar laid out gardens in Kashmir, which Jahangir refers to as Bagicha-e-Daulat, Khana, which is small gardens of the palace. He enlarged and elaborated this in spring 1620. Here the famous lines of Amir Khusru are inscribed that I've just quoted. Nur Jahan was also known to have laid out the Bagh-e-Nur Afsar in 1621. Mumtaz Mahal laid out another garden known as Zahara Bagh in 1620, which was remodeled by Jahanara. Apart from these, there were also the funerary monuments, which I'm not going to talk about, which were also surrounded by gardens. Now, in order to be able to architecturally restore a garden, you need the help of archaeology. But it is very difficult to restore a garden structure unless and until there were some structures attached to it. You see, plants and foliage or that kind of a pattern would naturally completely disappear once something was built on it. And this is why most of the gardens that, of the Mughal period have actually disappeared. The main garden of Babur that we talk about is the one which is in Afghanistan. Now, in the earlier lecture, you got a very good idea of the garden which was at the back in Agra, the Taj Mahal. Now, how many of you have really gone to Agra, seen Taj Mahal, and seen that garden? Very few know that a garden that was laid out by Babur exists. We all know that he ordered that a temple be destroyed and a mosque be built. Nothing has ever been done to try to restore our concepts or our ideas of what the Mughals did in terms of laying out the garden. And as my previous speaker has pointed out very clearly, these gardens were also meeting places for ordinary people. Now, I'm going to limit myself to the depictions of these, and therefore I'll begin with, how the Persian paintings depicted garden and actually paradise. I'm going to begin with the depiction of paradise. First slide. Now, one of the things that we need to remember about Islamic art is that there was no actually such a thing as a national boundary even when they conquered a place, because it was considered to be based very much on certain religious inscriptions which actually stopped the people and banned the depiction of living beings. This was to a great extent followed in most of the countries, and what happened was that flora and fauna were given a great deal of importance, particularly in designs. In those days, they did not know that, trees have life. But even birds and animals were not depicted. So what happened is, yet, this depiction of live beings continued. And this was because they were taking on the traditions from the countries to which they had moved in. And interestingly enough, Islamic art, therefore, spreads across countries and continents to be incorporating cultures with which we do not associate Islam anymore. I will begin by showing you the first slide. Persian art. Kothay? World of Islam to hয়ে গেল তারপর yeah painting yeah I want to go into Persian painting. Where is Persian? Huh? No, it is the next slide. I want to go into Persian painting straight away. Yeah. You see, this is the depiction of paradise. You have Adam and Eve, and Falnama is actually like the Shahnama, which is known as the Book of Kings. And it begins with, the first man and woman, that is Adam and Eve. And interestingly enough, you will find, Iragita. Now look at the concept of paradise here. There is no concept of the garden, the one that we've been told all the time about the Chehrbagh and so on, the four quarters, or dividing space, etc., etc. The painting is two-dimensional, flat, very bright, luminous colors, which were there. It continued right into classical Persian painting. And the interesting part of it is that along with the paris, on both sides, who were probably included in the description, instead of the serpent, you have a dragon. Because Persian painting had derived a lot from Chinese painting. So the motifs are now changing, and this again also indicates a change in the perception of the people of what they think about paradise. Do you understand? And look at the figures, Adam and Eve, and how they look. And you will see that the physiognomical type also changes. And this, again, as I say, relates to the actual setting of, what the landscape or the garden is supposed to be. Next. Now, this became a set motif in classical Persian painting, the prince reading in the garden, And this was the romantic rendition of a ruler. His other side, interestingly enough, in the Baburnama that we have, which was illustrated in the time of Akbar, the first painting is that of Babur sitting and reading in the garden. And this motif was then continued in the later years also, as I will show you. Now, next. Now, when we come to Turkish painting, and this was also there in the Persian painting, you see, nature is not just static or is unable to speak for itself. Nature is animate, the animals speak, and men and women continue to actually communicate with them. So these asked, one of the things which traveled from India was the stories of Panchatantra, which in Mogul painting Mogul literature became Anwari Suheli, actually also in Persian. And here you see the animals all speak. Now from the animals speak to the flora, fauna, and the grounds also, they speak too. If you've read Orhan Pamuk, you would know that the man who was putting up the picture of a tree in a bazaar and telling stories, there the tree speaks back and said, I don't want to look like an actual tree so that all the dogs in Istanbul would come and piss on me. I want to be its meaning. So here, you see, the animals that are depicted also have an allegorical attachment to them. And this is how we need to look at the whole landscape. Now, next. This is the direct illustration of a story which was taken from India. That white elephant was born in India, and it was taken to Persia. And the whole stories revolve around it, And it also talks about the two cultures, as Persians then knew India, and about the fact that when they were talking about a story, illustrating it, the ground of the landscape was in some ways minimal. It didn't matter, it was only the background. So you see, it could be a garden, it can be the desert, it can be anything unless and until you are acquainted with that story, you will never be able to interpret that particular space as a particular space, and unless and until you come to a kind of a visual experience where it is close to what you actually see. Do you understand? So this whole concept of trying to represent or depict an actual space, a physical space, by paintings which were of the early medieval period, you will find that we have to take into consideration the visual language as it was developing, and the way the artists were also perceiving nature and then handing it over to the spectator. Next. Now I come to the Mogul painting. Now this is one of the earliest paintings of the garden that we find in Mogul painting. Here we have, this is known as the princes of the house of Timur. And they're supposed to be in this idyllic garden, which is the paradise. Now, the people who are, outside the kiosk are, from Timur downwards, the ancestors of the Mughals. And in the kiosk are seated Babur, Humayun, Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan. Now, the three figures in the kiosk were actually rubbed out. Their faces were rubbed out from the earlier painting, and the Shahjahani painters put in, by that time they'd learned to do portraits, the actual, the faces of Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan. I'll show you the next slide where you'll see the details. See, here. Whereas Babur and Humayun still remain as the Persian stereotypes, Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan have acquired faces which are to be found in their portraits. Now, this painting was probably done by two of the Persian masters who came in with Humayun from Shah Abbas's court in Iran. They were the founders of Mughal painting with Sayyid Ali and Abdul Samad. So the whole painting is actually done in the style of Persian painting, where light plays a very important part. And this is where you see the colors are all illuminated. And the garden is therefore done with those colors, painted with these colors, where there is a still light. So there is no shade anywhere. And at the same time, it is as if it is lit from the back. The whole thing is illuminated, and just as the human figures are illuminated, so is the grounds and the kind of colors that are being used there. Now, the point is that the painting itself is allegorical, and the symbolism that is used is transferring some of the literary metaphors into images, but mainly through color. Next slide. Yeah. Next. This is the portrait of Babur. And it is actually taken from one of the Baburnamas, which shows him sitting in the court. And you will find that there is a similarity between Babur and Humayun, who look identical, because you see, at that time, they hadn't been able to discover the portrait as yet. And the reason I'm showing you this slide is because Babur seems to have a really elaborate court, which he never did when it comes to, either from his memoirs or from the historians who wrote about Babur's life. He was constantly on the move. So it was mainly in the tent. But when it came to the depiction of it, and a leaf which was taken out and painted later, they placed him in the court as he should be. So you see, the court becomes the center of authority, just like all other places which the ruler inhabits. Next. Now we come to the actual portraits of Babur. He is seen there supervising the changing of the stream. This is supposed to be laying out of the garden of fidelity, you know. And the Baburnama was actually in Turkish. It was translated at the order of Akbar, and it was translated by one of his chief courtiers, who was also a very learned man, Abdul Ibrahim Khani Khanan. Now, 4 versions of the illustrated Baburnama has been found. One of them is this. By this time, you see, European influence had come in and changed the earlier Mughal style. So now the figures look more lifelike, or in some ways more naturalistic. And we get, but we still haven't got the portrait of Babur. But at the same time, what we have got is his gestures and the way the garden must have been constructed. You see the steps there and changing of the stream. And Babur talks about the way how he laid out the garden. He writes in his memoirs that this was, this Garden of Fidelity was 1508 to 9, which was done. And he writes that there are orange, citrons, and pomegranates in plenty. I had plantains brought in. They did well. Before that, I had sugarcane planted there. The garden is really looking up. Next slide. Yeah. Now you see the fruits of the garden being collected by the gardeners. And here, you see, it's now taken on, because the artist has also managed to get the language of how to do, something which creates an illusion of nature. They have able to bring the really, the Babur's garden in front of you from that particular period of time. And this, I think, is usually of great help to architects who are trying to think of what the Mughal garden must have looked like. Next. Now, this again is, you see, I'm going back to the stereotype that was formed of the ruler and or the prince, the romantic aspect of him sitting in the garden. This is a portrait of Humayun done much later, sometime in the 17th century, and probably by one of the later Mughal artists who placed him in this, garden setting. Next slide. Now, this is the Fatehpur Sikri being built, and it's an illustration from the Akbarnama. Now, one of the things that the Mughal artists had managed to accomplish by this time is not only draw the portraits of the rulers, but also the portraits of the common people. So you know how exactly what material was used, how it was used, and how it was carried, and the constructions actually took place. This is the building of Fatehpur Sikri. Next. The photograph of Fatehpur Sikri, where water became very important. And I'm not going to go into the architectural details, but if you remember, Fatehpur Sikri had to be deserted because, the river was moving away. Next slide. Now, interestingly enough, this is supposed to be Akbar's, the Ramayana, which was commissioned by Akbar, and it was translated once again by Badauni, a conservative poet who hated doing this but Akbar forced him to it. And this is a translation of the Ramayana, which was illustrated. But when the Mughal artists, they were still then working together. You see, they used to work in common, and specialization hadn't still taken place. It did much later. This, interestingly enough, this is supposed to be Sita sitting in the Ashok Kanun. Here's a concept of a garden, which is supposed to be of something that, you know, which is pre-Islamic. The style of painting is very, very rooted to the Persian column. If you once again look at the rocks, and which are very much the Persian rocks, and the way the whole composition takes place, has taken place, it seems to be a kind of a rocky space, and Sita is just sitting in the middle of it. So it's not a well laid out, organized garden in the palace whatsoever. So you see, this, the concept of the garden must have been changing from time to time, and the artists at the same time had a certain amount of, authority to depict their narrative as they wanted to. I mean, as long as this continued, there was a kind of a dialogue between Islamic and pre-Islamic culture. Next. This is from Bikaner. You see, I'm into now Rajasthani painting, when by the 16th and the 17th century, most of the Rajputs had become Mughal nobles, as you will find. And here you have the story of Krishna, but at the same time you have the concept of the inner garden and the outer garden, the inner house. And there are two incidents which are taking place together and within the same frame. So actually there is Radha standing outside waiting for Krishna in the garden, and here is Krishna outside the walled space talking to her friend to be taken in. Now, this means that it gives you an idea of the architecture, but in art historical terms, it gives you a very interesting idea of the perspectives that are used. You see, it seems as if you're looking at the painting and at the figures from on top. So you have a multiple perspective. The wall doesn't shut you out, nor does the story, continue only in one space. So time, space, and the design are sort of worked together in such a way, and the garden only forms a part of it. Next. Now, European influence had come onto Mughal painting by 1580, and here you have one of the paintings by an artist who was considered to have specialized during the period of Jahangir. His name was Ustad Mansoor, and he did a lot of animal drawings and also did portraits. And Abul Hassan, who did a number of allegorical portraits of Jahangir. Now, what is very interesting here is at the bottom of it, you will see a shepherd, European shepherd, sort of trying to climb up the tree. And that shepherd is taken straight from Flemish engravings. So you see the kind of exposure they had to depictions of flora, fauna, nature, and so forth. And the other thing is, you must also remember that the tree of life was also a symbol of paradise, and therefore could fit in very much with the Islamic, Judeo-Christian symbolism. Next. And now we have Dara Suko. I'm sorry, I do have a colored slide, but I couldn't find it, so I brought it, the black and white. But it shows you Dara Suko visiting a hermit in the hermitage. He was greatly prone to visiting, holy men and philosophers, both Sufis and Hindus. And here you have, again, the laying out of the, the garden and the space of where this man, stays. And it's not to be considered as a luxurious place, not like the palaces, not like the courts. Next. I would also like to show you that landscape also consisted of the, the surrounding woods, where the rulers, the Mogul rulers particularly, used to go in for hunting. Now, there's a special kind of hunt which is called kamarga, where they would enclose the entire area with tins and then start beating the drums so that they, all the animals were then herded into this space. And then the hunt would start with the ruler starting first. After some days, then they would come out and would allow the villagers to participate. And in this kind of a hunt, it is written about Akbar that he was, he felt so sick of the bloodshed that was taking place in this kind of a hunt that he just moved away from there. They couldn't find him. And then finally, they found him sitting on a stone quite outside the village in a trance. And from then onwards, Akbar stopped having meat served to him. And which is why, later on, it was always said that Akbar had sort of moved towards Hinduism. That was not always the case. It was probably a kind of, his own feeling of revulsion against this kind of a bloodshed. And hunts were also supposed to be mini wars. It was like a war. The next one will show you. Yeah. Where is this? Yeah. This is, again, a document to remember because it is Jahangir who is showing Prince Karan, the defeated prince of Mewar, how to hunt. And this is in the Indian Museum. You see, after Amar Singh was defeated, Karan was taken in as a hostage. And Jahangir writes in his memoirs that this wild boy is very difficult to teach manners. I'm trying my level best. The queen has done her level best also. They give him good food, they give him clothes, they give him a pearl necklace, but he still manages to remain quite wild. So I think in order to show him a sophisticated way of hunting, from the way the Rajputs were used to, he took him to show him how to hunt. But the interesting part of it is that if there was this kind of animosity between the Mughal rulers and the Rajputs that we have been taught in history, or as is being now rewritten in our history books, would it have been possible for Jahangir to take an enemy into the hunting ground and hand him a gun? So you see, this became a kind of, all these paintings and all these illustrated texts became historical records for us to construct a time in which the landscape only formed a background. It was slowly moving into the backspace, which was where the narrative was actually about people. And so when you're moving from lyrics to history, you're using paintings and you're using the space that is being depicted as a kind of record on which this history was enacted. Next. Now we have Jahangir at the Dorga of Mainuddin Chishti. This was the Sufi saint, and it was Mainuddin Chishti was considered the patron saint of the Mughals, and his son, Selim Chishti, was the person where Jahangir was born. So his actual name was Selim. Jahangir is a name that he took for himself. And at the age of 40, in order to pay his debts, he went to Mainuddin Chisti's Dargah, which is at Ajmer. And there, you see, as I said, the landscape also became a place, or the garden also became a place where social events took place, where festivities took place. And here, he's feeding the poor. And in that way, you get not only the ruler as a charitable person, as a benevolent ruler, and as a benevolent despot even, but you also get the faces of the people over whom this rule was extended. You get the laborer, you get the beggars, and you get the people who are allowed to assemble in a holy place, which becomes, something which can be thrown open to all. Next. Again, a hermitage. Now, by this time, I'm moving into the Shah Jahani period, when the Mughal artist was learning how to use light in what is known as chiaroscuro, that is, use light and shade to create a dramatic moment. The picture is no longer lit by a constant light, nor is it lit from outside, where colors are no longer important, but the light itself is throwing shadows and creating an illusion of nature so that you know what time of the day it is. It is not a day, it's at night. And these fire-lit or lamp-lit sessions with the holy men becomes again a very interesting and a favorite topic of the Shah Jahani painters. Next. But it also gives you an idea of, what the hermitage looks like and what the gardens look like. Next. Next. Oh, I'm sorry, the previous one, yeah. I'm moving into Murshidabad now because Murshidabad was considered one of the succession states. And Murshid Quli, who, combined in himself the office of the Diwan and the Nazim, actually was almost ruled the whole place, but he was still very obedient to the Mughal emperor. And he used to send the revenue regularly from Bengal. Now, this was a city which was planned very much in a kind of an intercultural way, so that you had Hindu temples like Rani Bhavani's, which is, right across the river. You had a large number of temples even within the Murshidabad cities, a number of mosques, madrasas, maqbaras, and also, these funerary monuments which Murshid Quli ordered for himself also. Now, this shows the palace garden where he's sitting on the terrace. And, the garden is lit by these fireworks because it is the Prophet's birthday. And this is the time when lots of men, holy men, learned men, poets, artists, all converge to Murshidabad, and they were also given a lot of presents. And it's a special moment of commemoration. And this is done very much in the provincial Mughal style. So you see, the continuation goes on, and except for the Darbar, you have now a more intimate scene. Next. Yeah, Ali-Vardi Khan shooting, So the concept of, the landscape, where there is also woodlands and rivers, etc., are there. But at the same time, they're learning how to depict perspective. So you have here that kind of a landscape, once again, where the river becomes very important and where the nature is considered to be wild. It's no longer, the animals don't speak to Ali-Vardi. Ali-Vardi is hunting, and the hunting and his entire gesture is one of power. He's taken up his mace, and he's trying to throw it. Next. This is Sirajudullah. Again, this painting is in the Indian Museum, and it's supposed to be a scene of a Naika. And it was interesting that we found later on that the portraits of Shiraj showed that the face of Shiraj was placed on this Nayak. So, you know, another transformation now takes place where the Muslim ruler becomes the hero of a romantic, narrative in which Radha Krishna usually plays. And here Siraj becomes the Nayak, and you have this imaginary Naika. But the garden is laid out, as it was laid out supposed to have been in Murshidabad painting, continuation from the Mughal. Next. This is an interesting painting. It is a painting of illustration of a Ramayana, which was commissioned by Sir Elijah Impey. So when the company officials came in, some of them became collectors. And usually we hear of a man called Fullerton, but it seems that Elijah Impey, who had commissioned a number of botanical drawings, also acquired these kind of manuscripts. It isn't very long that it has come to light. And, we find that a definite continuation of it's done very much like, the Pahari painting and the later Rajasthani. Sort of a fusion of the Mughal and the Rajasthani and again of the Pahari paintings, which shows a very lush garden. And once again, here you see the Sita, and not Sita, you see Ram and his entourage sitting in the forest, which is the Tapovan. Next. Now comes Hajardwari. Now, even as late as 2005, we hear that in a sumptuous production which talks Murshidabad as the lost capital, it says that in the 19th century, when the Nawab Nazims were supposed to have lost all their power, even then Murshidabad was still prosperous because the Nazims hadn't all lost their power. They used a lot of their money to build a palace as sumptuous as that of Hajardwari. The historical records tell us something different. I will read this for you. The Hajardwari Palace, which was completed in 1837, Syed Mansur Ali, who was then the Nawab Nazim, had a personal collection of records printed and circulated among all the people, and particularly among the noble houses in India, that I appeal to your sense of justice, right honorable sir. Perhaps the grossest case in which funds were appropriated by the regent without due consultation with the Nizamat was in furnishing money for the palace at Murshidabad. That palace cost upward of 17 lakhs of rupees, being built wholly in the European style, is totally unsuited for the residence of a native prince. Privacy for native ladies cannot be obtained, nor are there any means by which they may, without exposure, enjoy the fresh air and take exercise. So this was the Hajardwari Palace, which was considered to have been the gift of the colonial powers to our native princes. And next slide, please. We have the portraits of, the new rulers who have come in, Warren Hastings and his wife. Now, this is there in the Victoria Memorial Hall itself. It was painted by one of the most famous of the artists who came to India, John Zofani, who was from the Royal Academy. And the social attitude of the company officials are to be reflected in the kind of lifestyle that they pursued, and particularly in their treatment of their servants. The native servant is best recorded in this group, if you see. You know the woman, the black woman wearing a European dress. In England, most of the portrait painters during this time, except leading artists like Hogarth, Reynolds, and Gainsborough, had moved to the provinces, hoping to gain the patronage of the country squires. The portraits they painted were usually of the patron, his wife, and his dog, with his lands behind him. So you see, the garden has now is being transformed from paradise into property. The same form of composition was generally transported to India. Even important artists like Zofani painted in the same fashion when in India. Warren Hastings and his wife were painted against the green lawns and white mansions of the governor's house in Calcutta. Here, the Indian connections emphasized by the presence of the dark Indian girl, the maidservant. Clearly, the servants were required as particular details in the general pictorial schema only when recording the wealth of the patron. Next slide. The Murshidabad house in Calcutta, opposite St. Xavier's College, as it is now. Thank you.
For this extremely interesting and fascinating tour through the Mughal paintings from the time of Babur to even Murshidabad and Siraj-ud-Dowla. And we have been looking at, Rothnapuli has been looking at the changes in the language of painting, the gardens, the landscapes, how these were being depicted, and we come up to actually the company times. And I think Professor Chatterjee would encourage questions. So questions, responses are welcome. So it's open, the paper is open for discussion.
Well, you see, this is something that this is a problem that I've been trying to also grapple with when I was trying to put my material together. Now, the garden, in terms of, the way we look at painting, is mainly seen as a backdrop. The kind of landscape painting which came into its own in European painting somehow never occurred during the Mughal period. We don't have a single painting of where there is only the forest without any animals or human beings in it. At the same time, since there is this literary tradition of animals and nature interacting with each other, and that most of it is also allegorical, that there is this constant element of moving from the actual to the imaginary and the real. So the garden, as I said, unless and until you come to a depiction where you are sure that the other depictions tally with it. For example, if I'm sure that, this is how Babur actually looked, or Akbar actually looked, by comparing him with the other paintings and where he's supposed to be growing older, which is something that was most unusual and only to be seen mainly in Mughal painting, then I can also tell you that this is probably how the garden was laid, in the period by Babur. But at the same time, the garden and the landscape are not synonymous. You see, the garden merges into the background when the story is not about the garden. If there is a story about the animals and the garden and the plants and the trees reacting, then it takes center stage. But at the same time, it no longer remains just a garden. it either becomes a paradise or it becomes, a place of fairy tale, or, like in Shirin Farhad, where the woods, she could see her paintings being hung there. So the forest then would be a background to Shirin's paintings. I mean, a depiction of Shirin. And very much a part of the romantic narrative that was being said. And as I said before, as Orhan Pamuk, much better than me, has been able to explain that the tree didn't want to be a tree. The tree wanted to be its meaning. So if you're all the time looking for meanings, we, as those who are trying to study art history as a kind of historical record, are also constantly negotiating between how metaphors and words are turned into images.
The transformation of garden as paradise to the notion of garden as property with the colonial period. Now, the point is, even the Mughals were coming and they were conquering large tracts of land, creating their own palaces, their own gardens, their own motives, which are also, in a way, the imprint of power which is coming and conquering unknown, other places. So, do they ever conceive of their garden and their, whatever lands, patterns that they're creating as property? And if it is not there, why not? Is it purely a part of the business, the kind of, the colonial power came as East India Company to do business. So is it a part of their mercantile mindset, which was not there with the Mughals?
No, I think that, again, once again, if you look at the history, illustrated history, you will see once again, as the narrative continues, that the background of the landscape is seen in incongruity with it. For example, if you're looking at a particular scene of war, and in the Shahjahanama there are many, such scenes where you can see the fort and the surrounding territory. And you can see that the Mughal ruler is not conquering only the fort, but is actually conquering the entire, area around it. So depends on, what the narrative is and how that narrative is being illustrated and the garden used in that. Because I'm quite sure when they were actually laying out the gardens, what became more important is in the context of the palace gardens, those which were Diwani Aam and which were Diwani Khas, had two distinct separate functions. Architecture has a more functional basis to it, and I'm sure you would be able to answer that better than I do, that most of these inner gardens, particularly in Muslim household and also in the Hindu households, which is known as the Ondur Mahal, was very much in the control of the women. And the outer space was very much the domain of men. So like the Diwani Khas and the Diwani Aam, at Diwani Aam and the surrounding garden round it would be considered as a show of wealth, whereas inside it would be a more intimate space of pleasure. And as it happens, you see, when you're talking about a social event taking place and charities being distributed, at once, of course, it is then an area of authority. But, because I'm talking about depictions, I find that what comes in, through the evolution of styles is that the way Warren Hastings and his wife have been depicted is not the way that the Mughal ruler would be depicted with his harem. And incidentally, you see, one of the important books that we read as students of history when we were talking about company rule and drain of wealth was The Rule of Property. So, you know, the planter Raj and the rule of property, this shows that space and, you know, the way space was looked at was different from the way the colonial. Sure, and look at the procession, you know, paintings which are there, you know, and also they later on created the darbars. You know, the company was known as the Company Bahadur, and then the company, you know, started having darbars. So, but interestingly enough, the company, I don't think, ever reproduced the Mogul Garden.
Thank you. The move in Britain from the garden connected with domesticity, personal possession, personal space, to the notion in Victorian period of municipal park was one, the idea of leisure space, especially for the emerging working class, but it also had a very significant health component to it. The municipal parks were built in Britain to actually improve the health of children and to counter the effects of respiratory disorder and to improve exercise and diet. Was that sort of component transferred here as well?
Well, I think once again, you would be able to answer that better than I can, but I do remember that, you know, books have been written now on Calcutta, where they're talking about, you know, how the city was laid out, and the question of, you know, the question, as you said, scholar, miasma, you know, that kind of these things, and where the hospitals were to be, and most important of all, how the entire city was divided into two. You know, the native black city and the white, you know, the city for the tribes. And there, once again, the houses there also looked quite different from the native cities. Till, you know, the gentry and the landlords here started taking in, you know, the colonial mansions. I mean, but at the point where I think I have stopped is something which is not recorded, is that how the architecture and lifestyle are connected together, and that there was always a protest about changing from one lifestyle to another. And that it had happened at, particularly, we were lucky to have found the records in Murshidabad. I don't know about what happened in Lucknow. I'm sure there was.
Very, very important. So small towns had company bags. I mean, let alone, you know, the metropoles. So this was like kind of widespread colonial thinking that nature will be good in disease prevention and amelioration of. Because by then, I think the germ theory by 19th century had already, you know, taken over the public imagination in Europe. So
yeah, no, but you see, this is it. This is precisely what I'm trying to a point that I'm trying to make is that the entire concept of city planning, you know, was different from the way the Mughal cities were planned and the British cities were, you know, the company, when the company moved in. So naturally, and what you call also, think about colonial medicine. It needed a lot of persuasion for people to receive that kind of medicine. So the other thing is that you see it writes, it's there very clearly that the Muslim noblemen did not consider that the fact that giving them a park, even if it is next to their house, would provide their wives and children with the fresh air they needed. They wanted they wanted the garden to be inside. And in the rural areas, one of the ways, you know, where people communicated was around the pond, you know, where they were gathering fresh water to take back home for drinking water. So this entire concept of a lifestyle is associated with the dwelling places, and also the way then, you know, how things are planned and it's done. and so on and so forth.
Exactly the company's activity or the colonial activities for preparation of the garden, it started primarily for trade. When the sea trade were open, then the Danish, the French people and the Portuguese came, and afterwards the British came. They started preparing the garden not particularly for art or these. They started activity for the garden for revenue purpose. So that was the primary purpose for them, that the economically potentially plants should be introduced, that should be trialed, and that should be distributed in different favorable climatic region for commercial cultivation. Though there are secondary aspects also. Say, for example, this Calcutta Botanic Garden, which was established during company's regime in 1787, though the primary aspect was for introduction of the economic plant over here, but the secondary thing was there, as because that time Calcutta was the capital, so the Britishers used to come over there and to roam there, and there were several structures where they used to pass their leisure time. So there are two aspects. Company, when it started these activities of gardening, that's different.
Good afternoon. I have a very brief response to share with the House. We have come across excellent appreciation of the architectural, aesthetic, and emotional context of the metaphor of garden. My question is this appreciation complete unless we bring in the political coordinates of class and caste in the analysis of this metaphor of gardens, because it may have a long history of displacement, deprivation, and oppression. And I just want to quote from Tagore's oft-quoted poem, Dui Bigha Jomi. I am going to quote the speech of the Bhushami. Bapu jano to he, korechi bagan khana. Pele dui bighe, prostheo dighe, shaman hoibe tana. Thank you.
This is very much a comment on the permanent settlement. The permanent settlement zamindar, actually, I mean, I'm no apologist for the Mughals, but I must say that the Mughal zamindar actually tried to tie the peasant to the land, because they used to take the revenue from the products itself. Whereas the permanent settlement zamindar tried to evict the peasant from the land, and this poem was directly at those permanent settlement zamindars.
Any other questions? Otherwise, I think we could bring this session to a close. Very interesting session, and I'm sure you still have many questions to ask, which... So thank you very much, Rothnapuli Dean, and thank you to all of you, especially for your questions and for your patience.
Hello. My thanks to Professor Jayati Gupta, Professor Amita Sinha, and Professor Rothnapuli Chattopadhyay. We bring today's session to an end. Tomorrow we resume our discussion from 11 sharp, and I hope to see all of you and many more tomorrow. So till then, very happy good evening.